call.
Chair.
Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, and it's a pleasure to take a call on the Gambling Amendment Bill number 2. And can I first of all congratulate the Minister in charge of the bill, listed on the top of the bill, the Honourable Rick Barker. Of course, Rick Barker hasn't been a member of the House for about 3.5 years now, and it's about 8.5 years since he introduced the legislation in the first place. Such is the present government's commitment to addressing problem gambling that the bill has sat for that long on the order paper without any action to try and address it. Can I congratulate the Minister currently in the chair? I believe he's about the 5th or the 6th Minister to be given responsibility for progressing this legislation. And can I also note that he's had significantly more success in doing so than many of the ministers who sat in the chair prior to him. I want to say that I think that that's important because I support the intention of the Gambling Act as it was passed at the time, which is to reduce problem gambling in New Zealand, to crack down on the abuse of Class 4 gambling, and of course to put in place a mechanism in the form of the Gambling Commission that creates an arm's length relationship from government that puts some independence in the decision making that takes place with regard to gambling. And I want to refer in particular to the provisions in Part 2, which our members will find on page 10, and Clause 8 in particular, which talks about an increase in casino gambling. And it gives the Gambling Commission the absolute authority to determine what constitutes an increase in the opportunities for gambling, for casino gambling. And why does the bill do that? The bill does that because we believe as a parliament that it is important that those decisions are made independent of government, that decisions around the increase in casino gambling are made independent of government. This government have no regard for that. It's absolutely ridiculous that this House is making changes to those provisions at a time when the government are unilaterally increasing opportunities for casino gambling and therefore increasing opportunities for gambling harm in order to get a dodgy deal with the Sky City Casino. This bill specifically gives that responsibility around decisions for increasing casino gambling to the Gambling Commission. It removes it from the government. It says that the government shouldn't be involved in those things, and yet we know that this government have been actively involved in those things because that was the trade-off that they made to get a free...
Order. Sorry, the member will sit down. The member may or may not have been in the House at the time. We had an earlier discussion when I sat the previous member down for broadening out the level of this debate. The debate is very narrow. The clauses are very narrow. Other speakers have kept it narrow, and members are expected to maintain that level. Thank you.
Point of order, Mr Chair.
Point of order.
Mr Chair, I refer you specifically to page 10, Part 2, Clause 8, Subpart 1, Subpart 1, which says that decisions on what constitutes an increase in the opportunities for casino gambling are a function of the Gambling Commission. That is exactly the clause that I am talking about, and it is directly relevant to this debate.
Thank you. The reference to such things as dodgy dealings between the government and Sky City that the member made are not appropriate for a debate that's kept this narrow. Please maintain the narrowness of the debate and the clauses under
Point of order, Mr Chair.
Chris Hipkins.
Mr Chair, in my comments I was referring to the need for independence, which is exactly what this clause deals with. It specifically gives the Gambling Commission the authority for those things, and it is perfectly in order to discuss why that should be independent.
The member will regain his seat. Won't be taking any more advice from the member on this matter. I'm in the chair at the moment. The member will respect the ruling that I've given. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, it is important that the Gambling Commission has discretion and an arm's length independence from government when it makes decisions about increasing the opportunities for casino gambling. Because if that is not going to be the case, then the rest of the clauses in this bill that are about reducing problem gambling in casinos are simply redundant, because it means that the government would be able to override that at will without any reference back to the casino, without any reference back to the Gambling Commission. And that is simply an abuse of the position, and it means that the provisions that are being passed in this bill are meaningless, because it means the government pay lip service to reducing problem gambling, but they don't actually walk the talk. They don't walk the talk, and that perhaps is one of the reasons why this bill has been sitting on the order paper for nearly a decade, because the government aren't actually interested in reducing problem gambling if that gets in the way of other deals that they want to do. Now, I want to talk as well about Class 4 gambling, because I acknowledge that Class 4 gambling is where some of the worst problem gambling takes place. And it's also where, if we go back to the history of why the Gambling Act was passed in the first place, some of the biggest rorts in terms of the proceeds of gambling took place. Now, I was a president of a students' association before the passage of the Gambling Act. And in that time, I was involved in trying to get money out of the pokey trusts for sponsoring different events, including the university games. And one of the deals that the pokey trusts used to do was, I will give X organisation money because it was all run out the back of the pub and there was very little accountability, and they would say to, say, a student sports team, we will give you money for your new uniforms or whatever, but they'll have to have our name on them, and we want half of the money that you are being given coming back across our bar. And if you don't do that, we're not going to give you the money. The reason that this bill, that the primary legislation that we're debating was passed in the first place, was to try and cut down on some of those things, because that is simply wrong. That was a rorting of the system, and it was wrong, and it was, and the first bill was an attempt to eliminate that. What, of course, has become abundantly clear since that time is it wasn't. It was very successful, but it wasn't completely successful. And there are still rorts in the system that this bill seeks to address, and I think that, Mr. Chair,
Chris Hipkins.
and I think that those are very welcome, because we don't want to have those kind of arrangements. That's not what the whole intention around this is. You know, if we go back right to the beginning of when pokie machines were introduced in New Zealand in the first place, and some would look back on that and say that that was a big mistake, and that in fact if we could turn the clock back we wouldn't introduce the pokie machines because of the problems that have gone with them. But they were introduced to be charitable, basically to generate revenue for charitable activities. That was the purpose of introducing the pokie machines in the first place. The type of arrangement that I've just mentioned was not really charitable. In fact, it was a rort, and it was designed to increase the profits of the business hosting the pokie machines rather than put the proceeds of the pokie machines to the charitable purpose that it was intended for. And so I think cracking down on that, and the further refinements that this bill makes to crack down on that, I think are welcome. I want to refer to the Select Committee report on the bill, which is published at the beginning. And I want to say that I regret that the Select Committee at the time, and we're going back 3-4 parliaments ago now when the bill was considered by Select Committee, I regret that they were unable to reach an agreement when it comes to pokie machines in outdoor areas, because that was a direct intention to flout the smoke-free provisions of legislation that was passed by this Parliament. And it meant that they could put pokie machines outside, people could sit there and smoke on them outside, and it was one of those things, you know, smoking and gambling, two very addictive things. It meant that people could meet both of their addictions at the same time. And it's very regrettable that the committee was unable to get a majority to make a recommendation to deal with that practice, because I think that is wrong. And I hope that you know, time has moved on and there is more broad support across the Parliament for smoke-free measures now than there was 8 years ago when it was discussed by the Select Committee. And I hope that we can actually get some agreement on that, either in this bill or in a future bill, because I think that dealing with problem gambling means breaking the cycle to some extent, and actually forcing someone to go outside to take a cigarette, to have if they're that addicted to cigarettes that they have to have a break to go out and have a ciggy, that breaks at least them sitting in front of the pokie machine for that continuous period of time, and that is a good thing. And so I hope that the House will at some point, either in voting on amendments and so on in this bill, deal with that issue, because I think that's very important. So overall, the Labour Party is in support of many of the provisions of this legislation, because we want to deal with problem gambling, with gambling harm. We introduced the legislation when Rick Barker was the Minister, and you know, they're very important provisions in this bill. Of course, I personally believe that they don't go far enough, and there is a lot more work to be done in this area, and I acknowledge that there are other bills coming before the House that are also going to be dealing with the issue of problem gambling, and I look forward to taking part in the debate on those.